Thank you.
Senator McIntyre.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Walden, for your presentation. I would like to do a follow-up with regards to the to one of the issues you have raised. That is the impact on the U.S. economy should Canadians be barred from entry in the United States, assuming C-45 becomes law. Obviously, the Canadian government has to take steps to protect Canadians who will seek to enter the United States. Do you believe that the government should pursue an agreement with the United States that would aim to protect Canadians from being prohibited, from being banned from entering the U.S.? Is that feasible?
I think it would be difficult to have like a formal agreement, right? Because it's like in Canada, for example, there is a provision in our immigration law that says if you have committed an offense that is punishable by a certain length of time in Canada, that renders you inadmissible. So if a U.S. citizen at this point comes to Canada and admits to having possessed marijuana, they could be technically denied admission into Canada and barred as well, in the same way that a Canadian, because it's still illegal in Canada to possess marijuana, right? So the question then becomes one of policy, and then I think that the best one could hope for. It would be difficult to imagine how you would draft a specific exemption like that. I would think that it would have to be in the form of a policy, and the policy would be simply not to ask certain questions of officials, of Canadians when they cross the border.
The matter can get complicated because on one hand we have state jurisdiction and on the other hand you have federal jurisdiction, and it is the federal jurisdiction that controls the border,
right,
and enacts federal criminal law. That said, I just want to add to what the question that I was asked you a while ago about the agreement. If we don't have an agreement, what other steps might the Government of Canada be advised to take?
I think they need to communicate with the U.S. officials and explain that possession will be legal in Canada on a specified date, and at that point there will be Canadians seeking to cross into the United States who may have possessed marijuana, which in some parts of the United States and under federal law may be illegal, but that the Canadian government would request that the Americans not take action against Canadians in relation to activities that are illegal in Canada when they seek to enter the United States, and it would have to be in a formal request, government to government, that they do that. And then it will be up to the Americans to determine if they agree with this request and determine how they're going to implement it, right? And in Canada, I would expect that if it were the other way around and the Americans were coming to the Canadians, I think border officials could be directed to exercise their discretion to admit to Canada persons who may admit to having been in simple possession of marijuana. And so there are mechanisms in Canadian policy that would allow Canada to do that. So I would think that there are probably similar mechanisms in the United States that would allow Americans to do the same thing.
That's another question, Chair.
Okay.
You informed us that you read last week's transcript, and as you recall, officials from CBSA and Global Affairs Canada informed the committee that U.S. authorities have given no indication to them that their policies and practices on marijuana would change once C-45 becomes law. Those witnesses have told us that Canadians simply need to be cognizant of that fact when they seek to enter the United States. in your view, will exercising greater caution be sufficient to protect individuals from a potential lifetime ban?
Well, that's a complicated question, especially in view of the pre-clearance issues, right? And I think the U.S. lawyer last week explained to you that as a lawyer, no one can ever counsel anyone to misrepresent, and it would be I would always say it's a very bad idea to not tell the truth to any official at any time. So if a Canadian's confronted with a U.S. immigration official who asks that question and the answer might be yes, they're better off saying, I'm not going to answer the question, I want to withdraw and go back to Canada. I think that was the advice of the immigration lawyer gave. So the fact that the Canadian official said that the U.S. policy isn't going to change means we're left in this sort of ambiguous situation, which from reading the testimony last week is that, generally speaking, U.S. officials are not going to ask, but there might be some who might ask. And if somebody asks, then a Canadian could be barred for life. That's the situation that we're confronted with now. So it seems to me the Canadian government needs to take cognizance of that and deal with it and say, look, this is a situation. What is the U.S. government going to do given the flow of tens of billions of dollars of Canadian tourist dollars to the United States? What are you going to do about this issue once the possession of marijuana becomes legal in Canada, and therefore we don't want Canadians to be banned for life from the U.S. for engaging in legal activity?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Waldman.
Thank you. Senator Desjardins, followed by Senator Jaffer.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Waldman, I understand your point of view quite well. Obviously, there's going to be after negotiations between the US and Canadian governments. So it's not going to be easy, of course. But having said that, the Quebec government has launched a TV advertisement explaining to teenagers and folks that the use of marijuana is nevertheless damaging for human health, and one has to be careful. And governments that enact legislation have a responsibility to inform Canadians and to make them aware of health issues. And the Canadian government and the Department of Health has never quibbled about saying tobacco use is bad for human health, and so I don't see why they wouldn't do the same when it comes to cannabis use. Now, given that this legislation is imminent, would you agree that the adoption of the bill, the delay of the adoption of the bill would be advisable so that we can inform Canadians? Because I think once the bill passes, it might be a bit late to educate Canadians on these matters. And it's my understanding that a number of provinces have agreed, including the Quebec, to do that outreach, and it's a provincial area of jurisdiction. But the cities expect to see some sort of financial spin-offs from marijuana, but they won't necessarily have that. Would you agree that this entry into force of the legislation should be delayed 1 year? Because, it's all, when you cross the US border, you're more nervous than you are than when you come back in the other direction. So what do you think about delaying the entry into force to make Canadians aware?
In terms of the health effects of smoking marijuana as opposed to cigarettes, it's well beyond my expertise, so I don't really feel competent to advising the committee as to whether we should delay the bill to educate Canadians about that or not. In terms of delaying the bill because of the border issues, I don't think that a delay is going to assist. What needs to happen is forceful communication between the Canadian government and U.S. counterparts as to the implications of the legislation, the expectations of the Canadian government vis-a-vis U.S. government conduct in the face of this legislative change. If we were doing something hugely controversial that would be viewed problematically, like legalizing heroin or something, maybe. But if 29 states have legalized it in some form or another, I really don't think that it's that controversial that we need to we can't go to the Americans and say, hey, look, 29 of your states have some form of legal marijuana. It's going to be legal in Canada. Just leave Canadians alone for simple possession, period. I think that's what we need to do.
Merci, M. Walden. Merci.